What if one of Russia's most successful geopolitical strategies has quietly become one of its biggest strategic liabilities? For years, the so-called Crimea model appeared to offer Moscow an effective blueprint for expanding influence without launching a full-scale conventional war. Support a separatist region, distribute Russian passports, maintain a military presence, and claim the right to protect Russian citizens if tensions escalate. In 2014, that formula fundamentally changed the map of Europe. But what happens when the same strategy is applied in a place where the military, political, and geographic conditions are completely different? That question brings us to Transnistria, a narrow strip of land most people outside Eastern Europe have never heard of, yet one that has played an outsized role in Russian strategy for more than 3 decades. Stretching along Moldova's eastern border with Ukraine, Transnistria declared independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. A brief but violent conflict in 1990 ended with Russian intervention, after which Moscow stationed troops in the region under the label of peacekeepers. Although no UN member formally recognizes Transnistria as an independent country, it has operated as a de facto state ever since, complete with its own government, security forces, currency, and Soviet-era political identity. For Moscow, however, Transnistria was never simply about protecting a small separatist enclave. It became part of a broader strategic concept that analysts often describe as the frozen conflict model. Similar arrangements appeared in parts of Georgia and, for many years, around Nagorno-Karabakh. Rather than annexing territory outright, Russia could maintain and resolve territorial disputes that complicated neighboring countries' ambitions to integrate with Western institutions. The logic was relatively straightforward. Countries facing unresolved territorial conflicts often encounter significant political and security obstacles when pursuing closer integration with organizations like an ATO or the European Union. By preserving these disputes, Russia retained long-term leverage over the foreign policy choices of its neighbors. For decades, that approach appeared remarkably durable. Moldova remained politically divided, economically fragile, and heavily dependent on Russian energy. Russian forces continued to guard one of Eastern Europe's largest Soviet-era ammunition depots inside Transnistria, while Moscow maintained influence without assuming the enormous costs of direct administration. Then came 2022. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine transformed the strategic environment across Eastern Europe. Instead of intimidating Moldova into remaining neutral, the war accelerated the country's movement toward Europe. Public support for closer ties with the European Union increased. Defense cooperation with Western partners expanded, and Moldova formally advanced along the EU accession process. Ironically, the very security concerns that Russia had long exploited became one of the strongest arguments for deeper European engagement, and that is where this story becomes far more interesting than another frozen conflict. Because the strategy that once expanded Russian influence may now be exposing its limits. To understand why, we first need to examine the mechanics of the so-called Crimea model and why any analysts believe it simply cannot function inside Transnistria the way it once did in Crimea. To understand why Transnistria has become such a difficult strategic problem for Moscow, we first need to understand what actually made the Crimea operation possible in 2014. Many people focus on the political narrative, the passport distribution, the referendum, or Russia's claim that it was protecting Russian-speaking populations. Those elements certainly matter, but from a military perspective, they were only part of the equation. The decisive factor was geography. Crimea was physically connected to Russia's military infrastructure. Russia already maintained the Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol under existing agreements with Ukraine. Thousands of Russian personnel were already stationed on the peninsula before the annexation began. Reinforcements, armored vehicles, logistics, intelligence assets, and air defense systems could all be introduced rapidly while Ukrainian forces were still struggling with political instability in Kyiv. In military planning, logistics often determine whether a strategy succeeds or fails. Without secure supply lines, even well-trained troops become isolated. And that is exactly the challenge Russia faces in Transnistria today. Like Crimea, Transnistria has no direct border with Russia. It is trapped between Moldova on one side and Ukraine on the other. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, any practical land corridor connecting Russia to Transnistria has effectively disappeared. Ukrainian territory is obviously inaccessible to Russian military convoys, while Moldova has made clear that it would not permit the deployment of additional Russian forces across its territory. The result is a simple but significant military reality. According to publicly available estimates, roughly 500 Russian troops remain stationed inside Transnistria. Their mission officially includes peacekeeping operations and guarding the massive Kovasna ammunition depot, one of the largest Soviet-era weapons storage sites still existing in Europe. However, those forces are increasingly isolated. Heavy equipment cannot easily be rotated. Personnel replacements face logistical complications. Any large-scale reinforcement would require either Ukrainian cooperation, which is impossible under current conditions, or highly risky air or amphibious operation that would almost certainly be detected long before reaching its objective. In other words, Moscow possesses a military presence without possessing military mobility. That distinction is becoming increasingly important. Analysts often describe military power as a combination of capability and access. Russia still possesses capable forces, but access to Transnistria has become dramatically more difficult than it was a decade ago. This logistical constraint also weakens one of the central assumptions behind Russia's passport strategy. For years, Moscow distributed Russian citizenship to many residents inside Transnistria. The political message was clear: if Russian citizens were ever threatened, the Kremlin could claim a responsibility to protect them. But protection requires more than legal justification. It requires the ability to project force. If military reinforcement cannot realistically reach the region during a crisis, then the credibility of that deterrent begins to erode. And while Russia has been struggling with geography, something equally important has been changing inside Transnistria itself. The biggest challenge to Moscow's long-term influence may no longer come from an ADO, Moldova's military, or even Ukraine. It may come from the quiet decisions being made by the people who actually live there. Military strategy explains why Russia's options have narrowed. That strategy alone does not determine the future of disputed territory. Demographics, economics, and individual choices often reshape geopolitical realities more slowly, but sometimes more permanently than armies do. That appears to be what is happening inside Transnistria. For many years, Moscow's influence rested on more than soldiers stationed in the region. It also depended on economic support. Russia supplied heavily subsidized natural gas, maintained financial assistance, and helped sustain much of Transnistria's public sector and industrial base. Those subsidies allowed the separatist authorities to preserve an economy that otherwise would have struggled to remain viable. In effect, Moscow helped finance the political stability of the enclave, but the regional environment has changed considerably since 2022. Russia's own economy has come under increasing pressure from the costs of the war in Ukraine, international sanctions, and growing defense expenditures. While Russia continues to support Transnistria, analysts note that maintaining long-term subsidies has become increasingly expensive compared with previous decades. For Transnistria, that matters. Its economy is small, export-dependent, and closely tied to surrounding markets. Although the region maintains its own institutions, many businesses rely on trade routes that ultimately pass through Moldova or neighboring countries. Economic isolation has become more difficult to sustain in an interconnected European market. At the same time, another trend has quietly accelerated. Many residents of Transnistria also hold Moldovan citizenship. According to publicly available information, Moldova has for years allowed many people living in the region to obtain Moldovan passports. More recently, as Moldova advances along its European Union accession path, those documents have acquired additional practical value. For many residents, this is less about ideology than opportunity. A Moldovan passport can offer easier international travel, educational opportunities, access to European labor markets, and greater economic mobility. Younger generations, in particular, often evaluate these practical benefits differently than older generations shaped by Soviet history. Rather than choosing between East and West through political slogans, many are making personal decisions based on employment prospects and long-term stability. This creates an uncomfortable strategic dilemma for Moscow. Russia has long justified its presence in Transnistria partly by emphasizing the interests of Russian-speaking communities and Russian passport holders. Yet if growing numbers of those same residents increasingly integrate economically and legally with Moldova, the political narrative becomes more complicated. Influence is no longer measured solely by troop deployments or diplomatic statements. It is also reflected in where people choose to work, which passport they carry, where they send their children to university, and which economy they expect to build their future in. None of this means that Transnistria is on the verge of reunification with Moldova. Frozen conflicts often remain unresolved for many years, even when underlying political dynamics evolve. Local institutions remain intact. Russian troops are still present, and negotiations over the region's status continue to face significant obstacles. However, the long-term trajectory appears different from what many analysts expected a decade ago. Instead of military escalation dominating the story, the balance may increasingly be shaped by economics. demographics, and gradual political integration. And that leads to an even larger strategic question. If Transnistria is no longer serving Moscow as effectively as it once did, what does that tell us about Russia's broader strategy across Eastern Europe, and what lessons are other neighboring countries drawing from this experience? When analysts discuss Transnistria, the conversation often focuses on a single disputed territory. But from Moscow's perspective, the issue has always been much larger than one narrow strip of land. For more than 3 decades, frozen conflicts functioned as strategic leverage, rather than controlling neighboring countries outright. Russia could preserve and resolve territorial disputes that complicated their security policies, discouraged foreign investment, and created political uncertainty. The objective was not necessarily territorial expansion, it was influence. For many years, that approach appeared effective. Today, however, the regional environment has changed. The war in Ukraine has forced Russia to devote enormous military, economic, and political resources to a single theater. According to publicly available assessments, maintaining combat operations, replacing equipment losses, and supporting a wartime economy have become long-term strategic priorities for Moscow that inevitably limits flexibility elsewhere. Transnistria illustrates this challenge. Russia still maintains a political presence. It still maintains military personnel. It still possesses historical influence over parts of the local population, but influence is most effective when it can be reinforced with credible options. In Transnistria, many of those options have become increasingly constrained by geography. Military reinforcement is difficult. Economic subsidies are more expensive than before. Diplomatic leverage has weakened as Moldova deepens cooperation with European institutions. None of these developments alone fundamentally changes the balance. Together, however, they gradually alter the strategic equation. Equally important is how Moldova has responded. Unlike Ukraine, Moldova has not attempted to resolve the Transnistria issue through military force. Instead, successive governments, particularly in recent years, have concentrated on economic reforms, institutional development, energy diversification, and closer integration with the European Union. Whether that strategy ultimately succeeds remains uncertain. EU accession is a lengthy political process, and Moldova continues to face significant economic and governance challenges. Nevertheless, the country's current direction suggests that long-term competition may increasingly be decided by governance and economic opportunity, rather than military confrontation alone. This reflects a broader lesson that extends beyond Moldova. Modern geopolitical competition is not always determined by who controls the largest army. It is also shaped by which political and economic system offers a more attractive future for ordinary citizens. Military power can preserve influence for years. Economic opportunity can gradually reshape loyalties over generations. That distinction may become increasingly important across Eastern Europe. At the same time, it would be premature to conclude that Russia has lost its position in Transnistria. The conflict remains unresolved. Russian troops are still deployed. The security situation around Ukraine continues to influence every strategic calculation in the region. Any significant escalation elsewhere could quickly alter today's assumptions. For now, however, the larger story is not one of dramatic battlefield victories or sudden territorial changes. It is the story of a strategy encountering a very different geopolitical environment than the one in which it originally succeeded. The Crimea model depended on favorable geography, rapid military access, political uncertainty, and limited international coordination. Many of those conditions simply do not exist in Transnistria today. Whether that ultimately transforms the region remains to be seen, but it does suggest that the strategic playbook Russia relied upon in 2014 may be far more difficult to replicate in the Europe of the mid-2020s. And perhaps that is the most important takeaway. Sometimes the greatest challenge to an established strategy is not a stronger opponent. It is a world that has quietly changed while the strategy itself remained the same.